Hello guys, and welcome back to another video here today. Today I have something really interesting to show you. It's a uniform that a local veteran gave to me from my hometown. And her mother was in the British Army during World War II. Specifically, she was in the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Now, the ATS, which I'm going to call it, was created during World War II and was a women's branch of the British Army. Now, before I show you the uniform, I want to give a little rundown on the history behind the ATS and what they did during the war. Now, the ATS, which, as I said, was the women's branch of the British Army, had about 300 personnel that went over to France during World War II. Not all ATS personnel went over to France, only about the 300, as I said. But they were some of the last in 1940 to leave Dunkirk. So that's pretty interesting. Duties at first were cooks, clerks, storekeepers, stuff like that. And in 1941, though, it was decided to increase the numbers of the ATS, and about 65,000 women joined the ATS. Now, women between 17 and 43 were allowed to join, even though they did let some old WWII members from World War I to join also. Now, since the big influx of women joining the ATS, they also expanded their duties to orderlies, drivers, postal workers, and ammunition inspectors. They also helped out on the ACAC guns, such as operating the searchlights and stuff like that. Although they never fired the guns because apparently only men were allowed to. Now, the lady who wore this uniform during World War II, her name was Helen England, and she was a sergeant major stationed at High Legh, England, during the war. Now, she trained new recruits to the ATS, and she would make frequent trips to London to recruit new recruits. One story that her daughter told me is that when she recruited women to the ATS, she would have to hose them down and sometimes even shave their heads because of the lice and the fleas that came out of the bad neighborhoods at the time. These photographs are of Helen England and her friends at High Legh. Now, the really interesting thing is that Queen Elizabeth, back then Princess Elizabeth, was a big part of the ATS. And some ATS recruitment posters. On to the uniform. This uniform was worn by Helen England, and this is a British ATS uniform. So let's start with the cap. This is a normal, or this is a ATS women's cap that they would have worn. It has the burnt orange and the green piping and the brown, which signifies a usual cap that would have been worn by them. Here we go. Let's see. We can get the buttons. Yeah. So this is pretty neat. No markings on the inside, but it's okay. Yeah, so there's the nice hat right there. Nice piece of history. Then we come down to the tie. Here's the tie. Won't take it off, but it's her tie right there. And then we have the jacket, which has all the buttons except one, which has an interesting story with it. Apparently, she was pregnant with her daughter when she was wearing this uniform, and a button popped off. So, that's interesting. And while checking the pockets, which I always do, because you want to do that, I found, hold on, I think it's in this pocket. Be very careful. Found these patches here. Sorry. Here we go. And also, which is pretty interesting also. So, found these two patches. Oops. Oh, shoot. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Anyway, found these two patches in the pocket that I just took them out of. Lower left. Anyway, I looked them up a little bit, and I think they are from an ACAC. Because there were some ladies in the ATS that were on the ACAC guns. Now she could have been training some ATS recruits for the ACAC guns, but I'm not sure. But yes, these are the ATS patches for what I believe is the ACAC guns, but I'm not sure, because the ladies that I got this uniform from said that her mother was training, so I think I'll go with the story rather than the patches. So maybe the patches, as I said, maybe she trained like searchlights and stuff, the ladies on the searchlights. Anyway, I'll stop ranting about that. And I also found a 1946 wheat penny, U.S. wheat penny, which is pretty interesting. I guess she wore this uniform when she came back here, because she married a U.S. serviceman that she met during World War II. He was in the Army Air Corps, and they went back to the U.S. after the war and lived their lives here. So, guess that's how she got this penny in 1946. Interesting. This braid or lanyard here signifies that she's a sergeant major. The brown, blue, and pink, or red maybe worn a little bit. Alright, so to conclude my video, a special thank you to Helen Clinton and her mother for uniform and for serving in the military. And if you have any comments, anything that you would like to share, please comment below. That would be great. And please subscribe. That really helps me a lot. So, thank you. See you next time.